Shaktipat 2.
The true self, as revealed by the Buddha in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. The celebrated Beethoven interpreter and avant-garde composer, Artur Schnabel, he lived from 1882 to 1951, once famously quipped, "Tradition too often means a collection of bad habits." This does not only apply to traditions of music making, but equally, I would contend, sometimes to traditions of scholarship. If one were to ask most students and scholars of Buddhism what the Buddha's teaching on the self or soul were, I think it likely that one would almost certain receive back the stock, unqualified reply: the Buddha denied the self or soul, the ātman, and any kind of enduring essence or svabhāva. He utterly rejected and refuted all notions of a permanent self or soul, both in the Pāli suttas and in the Mahāyāna scriptures. So he says, if you were to ask most students and scholars of Buddhism what the Buddha's teaching on the self or soul were, you would likely get the standard orthodox reply that the Buddha denied the self or the soul, the ātman, or any enduring essence, svabhāva. This stance towards the self in the Buddha's doctrines is now effectively the received wisdom, quote-unquote, among the bulk of Buddhist scholars and Buddhist practitioners. It has become the habit of tradition and is rarely questioned. But is it, to quote Schnabel, a bad habit? Is the absolutist and almost automatic cry of no self, in fact uttered as enthusiastically, unconditionally, and universally by the purported Mahāyāna Buddha as by large numbers of his followers? I suggest that it is not, and to examine how we can break our possible bad habit of an all but blanket denial of affirmative teachings by the Buddha on the reality of an eternal self, we might profitably give our attention to the famed, yet in the West surprisingly little studied, Mahaparinirvana Sutra. As you will know, this sutra presents itself as the final Mahāyāna teaching of the Buddha, delivered on the last day and night of his physical life upon the earth. The sutra survives in its Sanskrit form only in 10 fragmentary pages. Fortunately for us, the sutra was translated into Tibetan and Chinese. The world's leading authority on the evolution of this text in its early and middle period forms is without a doubt Professor Masahiro Shimoda, who is, as you know, giving a series of lectures and seminars on the growth of the text and related matters this term. So I shall not say anything on that area of study here today, except to mention the main translation of the text which have come down to us, the main translations of the text which have come down to us. The shortest and earlier extant translated version is the translation into Chinese by Fa Xian and Buddhapadra in 418 CE. The next in terms of scriptural development is the Tibetan version, 790 CE, by Jinamitra, Tathagatagarbha, and Devachandra. And the lengthiest version of all is what is known as the Northern version, carried out by Dharmakshema in 422 CE. I shall quote from all three versions in this lecture, using English translations by my friend and colleague Stephen Hodge, as well as Stephen's proposed original Sanskrit terms for certain key phrases. Needless to say, I am indebted to Stephen for his invaluable work. Early in the Sutra, Tibetan version, in a section in which Professor Shimoda has identified as belonging to an early stratum of the Sutra's genesis, the Buddha is confronted by a number of zealous Buddhist monks who are keen practitioners of what we might term absolutist non-self Buddhism, namely the frequent meditative cultivation of the notion that absolutely everything is impermanent, marked by suffering, and is not self, ātman. To our surprise, the Buddha does not praise his enthusiastic monastic followers for their unremitting dedication to the non-self doctrine and its meditative cultivation, but actually castigates them for having fallen into quote-unquote extremes. He even dismisses as quote-unquote mistaken and worthless the rather proud mode of non-self meditation which those monks practice, and chides them for not understanding that his teaching of the meditation upon impermanence, suffering, and non-self is highly contingent and needs to be safeguarded from one-sided distortion and misinterpretation. According to the Buddha, the monks have grasped merely the outer letters of his doctrine, but not its essential meaning. They have fallen victim to an extreme and inverted form of meditative practice in which they view that which is truly eternal as something impermanent, that which is truly the self as what is non-self, that which is truly blissful as suffering, and that which is truly pure as something impure. They have failed to distinguish between what is samsara, what is of samsara, and what is of the great nirvana, the Maha-nirvana or the Mahaparinirvana. Samsara is non-self. Thus far, the monks are correct. But they have committed a serious metaphysical miscalculation, the Buddha indicates, by ascribing samsaric qualities and characteristics to the non-samsaric, to nirvana, indeed to the Buddha himself. For while everything that is samsaric is rightly labeled as non-self, the Buddha reveals in the course of the sutra that he, as the Dharmakaya, is nothing less than the eternal self, ātman, itself. The Buddha reveals in the course of the sutra that he, as the Dharmakaya, is nothing less than the eternal self, ātman, itself. In a striking reversal of the usual Buddhist dictum that all dharmas, all phenomena, are non-self, the Buddha declares that it is in fact untrue to say that absolutely all dharmas are non-self. And in the Dharmakshema translation, he goes so far as to declare that, in truth, there is the self, ātman, in all dharmas, phenomena. Offering a rare and seldom quoted characterization of what in fact the self is, the Buddha asserts in the Tibetan version, the self is ātman. The self, ātman, is reality, tattva. The self is permanent, nitya. The self is virtue, guna. The self is eternal, sāsvata. The self is stable, dhruva. The self is peace, shiva. In the Fāsyan and Dharmakshema versions, another quality is found also listed here, that the self is sovereign, self-governing, or autonomous, aishvarya. Furthermore, Fāsyan includes the adjective unchanging, untransforming, aviparinama, unchanging, untransforming, aviparinama, while Dharmakshema also adds that the self is true, satya. It is sometimes claimed by scholars who comment on the doctrine of the self in the Nirvana Sutra that when the Buddha speaks of the ātman, he is doing so in a concessionary manner, or in a provisional tactical maneuver for those of his students who are not yet ready to face up to the frightening enormity of the non-self and emptiness doctrines, and that what he really wishes to say is that there actually exists no self at all. We shall come back to the question of whether this text views itself as provisional or ultimate in its doctrines a little later, but for now, it needs to be emphasized that for the Buddha to assert something to be both satya and tattva, both adjectives appear alongside one another in the Dharmakshema text, is tantamount to his insisting that it is truly real, not just seemingly real or deceptively authentic. The term tattva, embedded in such metaphysical verbal environment, has the present context where rectification of a misapprehended non-self doctrine is center stage of discussion, really does betoken ultimate reality itself rather than some provisional metaphorical notion or accommodating makeshift simile of truth. When the Buddha in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra states that the self is real and true, he means what he says, shocking as this might seem. Let us consider a number of the other epithets applied to the true self in the passage just quoted. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, for this is arguably the core concern and dominant assertion of the entire Mahaparinirvana Sutra in its earliest extant manifestation, is the notion of the quote-unquote eternity or permanence of the Buddha, who is, we must remember, the true self according to this scripture, The Sanskrit term nitya is usually translated by Buddhist scholars as permanent, but I feel that this fails to do justice to the sense of never-endingness or never-enduringness that the word connotes in the Nirvana Sutra. The English adjective permanent is usually applied to something that lasts indefinitely. Yes, but not forever. For example, a person may be given a permanent post in the company for which he or she works, but that particular situation will of course last only for as long as the company survives. No one expects that the company will last forever, and nor will it, being a part of samsara. It will eventually decline, collapse, and die, as will that employee him or herself. But when the Buddha applies the epithet nitya to himself or nirvana, he wishes to express very forcefully the idea of eternal continuance and perpetual persistence throughout all time and beyond. The self that is nitya is not just real for 1,000,000 years or even 1,000,000 kalpas, aeons. It is real and lasting forever. So central in this concept of the nityata, or eternal continuance of the Buddha, in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, that the Buddha at one point refers to this scripture as the great sutra of the Buddha's eternity, nityata. Perpetual Buddhic reality would seem to lie at the heart of the message which this sutra seeks to communicate, as an antidote to the prevalent Buddhist notion of universal change, decay, flux, and death. The Buddha actually says so in terms. The Buddha's physical form will die, that is true, but the nirmana body, physically manifested body, is in any case deceptive and impermanent, the Buddha insists. He himself, in contrast, as the true self, will not reach any end or cessation. Closely linked to the concept of nityata are the ideas of immovable, unshakable fixedness or firmness, dhruva. And it's interesting to note that Dhruva Loka is the name of the pole star which fixes the galaxy, Dhruva Loka. Closely linked to the concept of nityata are the ideas of immovable, unshakable fixedness or firmness, dhruva, and unchangingness, aviparinama. The notion of aviparinam is found in both Fāshyān and Dharmakṣema in the passages that we are considering. Whereas Fāshyān uses it in its naked and unmodified form, however, the Dharmakṣema text combines it with the term ashraya, basis, ground, body, or foundation, to create the compound ashraya aviparinama. Thus, the foundational body, which is the self, is here asserted to be changeless. In other words, the opposite of virtually every other thing known to human mankind, which is subject to modification and mutation. The ātman never transforms. It is present within all dharmas. So, dharmakṣema. A base which never transmutes into something else. Self is, we might say, always and unchangingly itself. It is the irreducible, untransforming foundation or essence of reality. If the self never mutates or transforms, then it is impossible for it to be killed, since it cannot undergo the transformation inevitably wrought by death. Accordingly, in the Fāshyān version of the sutra, we find the expressive epithet unrubbed out, used of the ātman. The likely Sanskrit term underlying this is aparimardana, which means not rubbed out, not obliterated, not broken up or destroyed. We are perhaps reminded here of the colloquial English expression of wiping someone out or rubbing someone out to convey the idea of killing them. But unlike what the Buddha calls the lie of the worldly ego, made up of its 5 transforming and transient skandhas all doomed to death, the true ātman can never be rubbed out or erased. It endures, unperishing, forever. Finally, in this section, let us consider an adjective found in both the Fāshyān and Dharmakṣema scripts to characterize the self: sovereign or autonomous, Aishwarya. In Hinduism, Aishvarya Shakti, or the autonomous sovereign Shakti, is the Shakti of Narayana, the Supreme Bhagavan, who is seen as the absolute, infinite self, sovereign, autonomous self. Not only do we encounter the term in the present passage, but also scattered across the Dharmakshema text as a whole. For example, we read that on the morning of Buddhahood, he, the Bodhisattva, obtains the sovereign self. And on the all-pervasive presence of the Buddha, who cannot truly be seen and yet can cause all to see him, the Buddha comments that such sovereignty is termed the Great Self, Mahatman. This word, Aishvarya, is important for 3 reasons. First, it attests to the complete self-mastery, independence, and freedom of the self. It is not subject to the tyranny of unwanted internal or external forces, unlike the mundane ego comprised of the unstable, conditioned, and labile skandhas. Second, it hints at a controlling, regulating intelligence, a knowing and utterly free mind, the transcendental knowing, or lokatara jnana, which the Buddha elsewhere in the sutra links to the self. And thirdly, it is of course linguistically related to the Sanskrit noun Ishvara, which in the Brahminical environment in which Buddhism had its roots denoted God, more particularly the god Shiva. This attendant sense of the divine and the numinous would not, I'm sure, have been lost on the transmitters and auditors of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. So the true self is revealed by the Buddha in this important excursus on genuine selfhood to be totally self-governing, to be that totally self-governing, sovereign foundation or ground of reality, which is untrammeled by change and unmarked by mutation, and which endures eternally, utterly unassailable by death. The sutra, in somewhat later chapters, intimately links this Buddhic reality to the Tathagatagarbha, Buddha Dhatu, or Tathagatagarbha as it is variously named, and to this we now turn. In the chapter entitled the Tathagatagarbha, the Buddha declares to Bodhisattva Mahasattva Kashyap, the true self is the Tathagatagarbha, the Buddha principle, Buddha element, or Buddha factor. You should know that all beings do have it, but it is not apparent, since those beings are enveloped by immeasurable kleshas, mental and moral afflictions. The keen young bodhisattva will have none of this, however, and mounts a vehement verbal assault on the Buddha in an attempt to shore up the validity of the general non-self doctrine, attempting to argue for the total illogicality and impossibility of a real self. Does the Buddha at this point then modify, relativize, or even withdraw his revelation that the true self is the indwelling Buddha principle within all beings? Not a bit of it. He strengthens it by telling the tale of a rather witless wrestler who mistakenly believes he has lost a precious jewel, which he always wears fastened to his forehead, when in actuality it has been merely driven under his flesh by the force of his engagement in a bout with his wrestling rival. Then the Buddha states, all beings are also like this. Each one of them has the Tathagatagarbha, but through having recourse to evil acquaintances, they give rise to attachments, hatred, and stupidity, and fall into the 3 miserable states, adopting various kinds of bodies throughout the 25 modes of existence. The precious jewel, that is the Tathagatagarbha, is buried within the wound of the kleshas of attachment, hatred, and stupidity, so that they are unaware of its presence there. Engaging in the notion that there is no self with regard to the mundane self, they do not understand the skillful words of the implicit intent of the Tathagata. They have the notion that there is no self and are unable to know the true self. Regarding this, the Tathagata utilizes skillful means. He causes them to extinguish the raging fires of countless kleshas, revealing and elucidating the Tathagatagarbha to them. The Tibetan version states in this vicinity, the Tathagatagarbha is the intrinsic nature, svabhāva, or prakriti of beings. The Tathagatagarbha cannot be killed. Those who die are said to be short-lived, while the Tathagatagarbha is said to be true life. It cannot be severed or destroyed right up to the attainment of Buddhahood. The Tathagatagarbha can neither be harmed nor killed, but only nurtures the person. Furthermore, noble son, it is like a person who digs the earth searching for diamonds. Holding a sharp pickaxe in his hands, he digs into the ground and rocks, able to pulverize them all. Diamonds alone he cannot shatter. The Tathagatagarbha is like this, for it cannot be harmed by the sharp weapons of the devas and maras. It only nurtures the person, and anything that can be harmed or damaged is not the Tathagata Dhatu. Hence you should know that the Tathagata Dhatu cannot be harmed or killed. Moreover, the application of the notion of non-self and a dogged application of the idea of emptiness in the Tathagatagarbha, and the dogged application of the idea of emptiness to the Tathagatagarbha is firmly counseled against by the Buddha earlier in the Sutra, where he declares in very striking terms that by having cultivated non-self with regard to the Tathagatagarbha, and having continually cultivated emptiness, suffering will not be eradicated, but one will become like a moth in the flame of a lamp. We need to extract a number of key points from all of this. 1. As with the earlier situation in which the Buddha had been challenged by a group of his enthusiastically absolutist non-self monastics, he is here being skeptically probed by a great bodhisattva on the validity of the self notion, but the Buddha stands firm. 2. There is not a shred of evidence in this encounter, nor indeed the whole Mahaparinirvana Sutra as a whole, that the Buddha only spoke of a true self in order to win over those who dearly and desperately wanted to believe in the everlasting ātman, as is claimed by some commentators on the Sutra. Quite the reverse is the case. 3. It is shown as a deficiency in comprehension on the part of the Buddha's would-be followers when they take his non-self teachings as all-inclusive in their sphere of reference. Instead, such persons should understand that the non-self doctrine has certain limits, and the implicit counterpole to it, which the Buddha affirms, is namely that of an true self. 4. The revelation of the Buddhas on the reality of a true self is not present by reason, debate, syllogism, step-by-step analysis, or minute hair-splitting argumentation. Rather, it is presented precisely as a revelation from the Buddha himself. It is given as unvarnished, unadulterated fact, a fact which all beings, so we learn later from the Sutra, can only fully discern when they themselves become Buddhas. 5. The Tathagata Dhatu is utterly invulnerable to all assault and harm and cannot be made to expire. Indeed, it is the veritable immanent life principle, the jiva itself. 6. It is inappropriate to meditate upon the immanent Tathagatagarbha as though it were non-self, just as it were equally appropriate repeatedly to meditate upon it as though it were emptiness, as though it were a vacuous nothingness and did not inherently exist. To regard the Garbha in that fashion would be tantamount to committing agonizing spiritual suicide. 7. Whether the being is attacked by rebirth as a god or devil, the indwelling Tathagata Dhatu itself remains unassailed, inviolate, and deathless. It is utterly immortal, just as the Buddha himself, the Dhatu made manifest, is never actually shown to die in any of the major versions of the Nirvana Sutra. Outer narrative movement thus reflects and enacts inner metaphysical teaching. 8. The Tathagata Dhatu is not a destructive phenomena. Rather, it functions as a nurturing, a sustaining force within each and every single sentient being, and accompanies him or her up to and into the Buddhahood itself. But is all this to be understood as an ultimate teaching? Is all such talk of an eternal, immanent, yet transcendental self, or Tathagatagarbha, not just a ruse or skillful tactic to attract people who might otherwise be put off by the Buddha's general teachings on non-self? We have noted that this certainly does not apply to the major examples at which we have looked, but we need to consider what the status of this sutra is in its own eyes. How does it see itself, and how does it want its auditors and readers to see it? Is it a provisional in its doctrines, as the Gelugpas, for example, would claim? Or is it to be viewed as an ultimate metaphysical revelation of an eternal truth? On the specific question of the supramundane or nirvanic self, it is clear beyond reasonable doubt, I think, that the sutra does posit such an eternally abiding entity or dharma, what we might call the Buddha self, as a reality of the highest kind. That Buddha self is one with the very stuff of nirvana. In the Dharmakshema text, the Buddha is asked by Manjushri, "What is the meaning of this real truth which that you have mentioned?" The Buddha's reply is instructive and unequivocal. "Noble son, the real truth is the true Dharma. Noble son, if the Dharma is not true, then it cannot be called the real truth. Noble son, the real truth is devoid of distortions. The real truth is free from falsity. If it were not free from falsity, it would not be called the real truth. Noble son, that which is endowed with the eternal, bliss, the self, and purity is stated to be the meaning of the real truth." This definition of what constitutes authentic truth for a Buddha in this sutra is not only intrinsically eloquent and powerful, but is accorded added weight by the fact that the answer is addressed in a question asked by none other than Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of supreme Buddhic insight and wisdom. In this connection, we might also interestingly note that the teachings of the entire sutra in its Tibetan form are significantly entrusted precisely to Manjushri at the very end of the scripture, a clear symbolic act of denoting their ultimate importance. On the broader question of whether the sutra as a whole wishes to be seen as a high-level teaching or as a concessionary adaptation of Dharma for those of more rudimentary spiritual grasp, we should note the fact that the opening of the Tibetan version tells of how the Buddha will herein give the final explanation of his Dharma, and will do so in quote-unquote words which expressed his meaning with exhaustive thoroughness. The Buddha himself later tells a female follower of how on the day of his parinirvana he will give the essential meaning of all his secret dharma. He says, "When I am making preparations to pass into parinirvana, I shall then speak of the Tathagata's various secret words of implicational meaning in their entirety to the Shravakas, disciples. On that day I shall impart the intended gist to my sons." That day has of course now come. The colophon of the Tibetan text also declares that this sutra constitutes quote-unquote the essence of all scriptures of the authentic Dharma, and moreover is equal to an Uttara Tantra, that is to say, to the ultimate empowering instructions given at the very end of a medical treatise, so that the doctor will be fully equipped with the requisite vital knowledge and actuating power to make his mantras and remedies truly efficacious. The reference to an Uttara Tantra is not confined to the colophon. The Buddha himself has recourse to this image on several occasions, not least in intensified form when telling of the supremacy of the sutra's teachings. In the chapter entitled The Letters, he affirms, "The very ultimate Uttaratara of the meaning of all sutras is here taught by this sutra. Not one single syllable or title has been taught herein that has previously been heard by any Shravaka or Pratyeka Buddha. This sutra is supremely excellent, Varottama. For example, just as the people of Uttarakuru in the north are virtuous, likewise those who have listened to this great sutra have become supramundane. You should know that they are Bodhisattva Mahasattvas. Therefore, this signifies that this sutra is a great Uttara Tantra." Finally, we might usefully look at what the chapter designates the name and virtues of the sutra says on the relative merit of this scripture when measured against all other enunciations of Dharma and the meditations with which they are linked. The Buddha states, "For example, the various sciences such as medicine and the three sciences are gathered up in their respective Uttara Tantras. Similarly, all the various secret Dharma gates, the words of implicit intention, uttered by the Tathagatas are gathered up in this Mahaparinirvana Sutra. The Mahaparinirvana Sutra is stated to be the best, the most excellent, the foremost of all samadhis in those sutras. The Mahaparinirvana Sutra is stated to be the best, the most excellent, the foremost of all sutras." So after this little exploration of a key teaching of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, I hope that we shall be less liable to fall into the Schnabelian bad habit of knee-jerk, quote-unquote, no-selfism, which has sadly become the traditional hallmark of much modern Buddhist commentary, and he's absolutely right there. At least one major Mahāyāna Sutra, and of course it is mirrored by others, of the Tathagatagarbha class of sutras, such as the Srimala Devi Simhananda Sutra, Srimala Devi Simhanada Sutra, and the Anutva Apurnatva Nirdesha, offers us the chance of fresh perspective on Buddhism. And while this talk is certainly far from being such, the Mahaparinirvana itself promises its votaries that it truly does represent the all-fulfilling conclusion of the Buddha's Mahāyāna Dharma.